The bone folder sat in its paper sleeve for 38 years. It lived at the bottom of a shoebox, beneath a roll of ribbon and a birthday card that still smelled faintly of the perfume she used to wear. He had found it while packing, 3 weeks after the meeting where his family explained to him, calmly and with a printed agenda, that they had decided where he would be living from now on. He had not known what to say about the folder at the time. He had wrapped it in the sleeve again and placed it in the box he was allowed to keep. Outside, the oak in the front yard was dropping its leaves. He had planted that oak 22 years ago from a sapling no bigger than his forearm. He watched it through the window for a moment. Then he closed the box, picked up his coat, and walked out of the house without looking back. Some departures don't announce themselves. Some of the most permanent things in a person's life happen in complete silence on an ordinary Tuesday, while the oak is dropping its leaves and nobody is paying attention. He already knew what he was going to do. He just hadn't told anyone yet. Clifford Adeyemi had lived in the house on Sycamore Lane for 39 years. He had bought it at 32 when he and Adais were newly married, and the neighborhood was still the kind of place where people left their screen doors unlocked. He had repainted it 4 times. He had replaced the gutters twice. He had stood in that kitchen through 3 decades of school mornings and Sunday dinners, through Adai's illness and her death 2 years ago, through the particular silence that follows a long marriage and then, suddenly, doesn't. He was 71 years old, and he had never once, in 39 years, been late on a mortgage payment. The meeting was Brett's idea. Brett had always been a man who preferred meetings to conversations. He was 44 years old and worked in commercial insurance and believed, with the particular certainty of someone who had never been seriously wrong about anything yet, that problems were best handled with documentation and a clear agenda. He had emailed Clifford the night before to confirm the time. He had attached a 1-page summary. Clifford read the summary at the kitchen table with his coffee. He read it twice. Then he folded it in half, set it beside his mug, and waited. They arrived at 10 in the morning. Brett and his wife Suzanne, who managed a dental practice and had strong opinions about organization and efficiency. Clifford's daughter Renelle joined by speakerphone from Columbus. She had a new baby and couldn't make the drive, which Clifford understood, though he noticed she had not called him separately before the meeting to ask how he was. Brett sat across the table from him and laid out a second copy of the summary. He spoke in the measured tone he used in professional settings, the one that communicated reasonableness without inviting disagreement. He said that he and Suzanne and Renelle had been talking for some time. He said they were concerned. He said the house was too large for one person, that the upkeep was more than Clifford could manage, that the neighborhood had changed, that Meadowgate was a very well-regarded facility with activities and nursing staff and a dining room that had recently been renovated. Suzanne said it wasn't a nursing home. She said the word community 3 times. Renelle, through the phone, said she just wanted Dad to be safe. Clifford listened to all of it. He kept his hands flat on the table and he listened. When Brett finished, he asked one question. He said, "Did any of you ask me what I wanted?" Brett looked at Suzanne. Then he looked back at Clifford and said this wasn't about what he wanted. It was about what he needed. He said it gently, which was somehow worse than if he had said it with irritation. Clifford looked at his son for a long moment. He said, "I understand." Those were the last 2 words he spoke at that table. Brett laid out the timeline. The house would be listed in 6 weeks. The proceeds, after costs, would fund the room at Meadowgate. There was a waiting list ordinarily, but Brett had already spoken to the admissions director. A room was available. It had a window that faced east. Clifford nodded at each item as Brett went through them. He did not argue. He did not stand up. He did not raise his voice. He sat at the kitchen table where he had eaten 39 years of breakfasts, and he nodded. And when Brett was finished, he said he'd like some time to sort his things. And Brett said, of course, take as long as you need. And Clifford said 3 weeks would be enough, and that was how it was settled. He stood up, picked up the folded summary from beside his mug, and placed it in the recycling bin under the sink. Then he refilled his coffee and went to sit on the back porch by himself. The yard looked the same as it always had. The garden beds were going to seed, which he had let happen since Adeyemi died. The oak out front was a different tree than the yard, but he could see its crown from where he sat, that particular shape he'd watched for 22 years. He sat there for a long time. He did not cry. He had done his crying when Adeyemi died, and there was nothing left in him that wanted to go in that direction. What he felt was something quieter and more durable, something that had no name he could find, but that settled into his chest like ballast. He already understood something Brett didn't yet. He understood that being dismissed by someone who loves you is still being dismissed. He spent 3 weeks doing exactly what he had said he would do. He went through the house room by room methodically, the way he had always approached large tasks. He made 3 piles in every room: keep, donate, leave. He did not keep much. The furniture was Brett's problem now, or the estate agent's. He kept his tools, his work clothes, Adeyemi's sewing box, 40 years of small accumulated things that had meaning only to him, a box of her books, and a shoebox he almost passed over on the shelf in the back of the bedroom closet. He opened the shoebox to check what was in it: a birthday card, a roll of green ribbon, a small paper sleeve. He opened the sleeve and found the bone folder. He remembered the Christmas she gave it to him. He had mentioned bookbinding once. Years ago, the way you mention things you're curious about but never pursue. Adeyemi remembered everything. She had found the folder at an estate sale and wrapped it in the sleeve herself and given it to him with a look that said she had paid attention when no one else would have. He had thanked her and put it in the shoebox and never taken it out again. He held it now. It was smooth and slightly curved, about the length of his hand, made from pale ox bone that had gone the color of old ivory. He turned it over once, then he slipped it back into the sleeve and placed it carefully in his keep box. On moving day, Brett came with a rented truck. He was efficient and organized, and made sure Clifford's boxes were secured properly. He did not ask what was in them. Suzanne had sent a casserole, which was sitting in a carrier bag on the passenger seat of Brett's car. Clifford thanked him for the truck and the casserole. He shook Brett's hand. He did not hug him. Patrice Odom was sweeping the sidewalk outside her shop on Carver Street when the truck drove past. She had known Clifford since the years when he and Adeyemi used to attend First Baptist, before Adeyemi got sick and they stopped going regularly. She had not seen him much in the 2 years since the funeral. She recognized the truck as a rental, and she watched it pass, and she made a note to reach out. She called him 2 weeks later. She said she'd heard he was at Meadowgate, and she wanted him to know she was just down the street and a door was open if he ever wanted company. She did not say she was sorry. She did not say it must be hard. She said her door was open, and left it at that. Clifford sat on the edge of his bed in his east-facing room at Meadowgate and thought about that call for a while. The next morning he called her back and asked if she had any unused space to rent. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she had a back room she used for storage. She said it wasn't much. He said that was fine. She asked what he needed it for. He said he wasn't entirely sure yet, but that he needed somewhere to work with his hands. There was another pause. Then she said $40 a month and he could have the key by Thursday. He said, "Thank you." She said, "Don't thank me yet. I haven't seen what you're going to do to my storage room." He smiled. It was the first time in a while. The back room behind Patrice's shop was 12 feet by 9 feet, with one high window that let in the north light and a workbench someone had built into the wall and never removed. It smelled of dry cleaning chemicals and dust and something older underneath. Wood and paper and the particular stillness of a room that had not been used in years. Clifford cleaned it on a Thursday. He swept the floor, wiped the bench, carried out 4 boxes of Patrice's old tax records that she was relieved to be rid of. He brought his tools, a folding chair, and a lamp. He stood in the empty room and looked at it for a long time. He walked to the Dennisville Public Library that afternoon and checked out 3 books on hand bookbinding. He walked back, sat in the folding chair, and read all 3. He ordered supplies online from the library computer. Linen thread, bookbinding paste, a folding knife, bone folders of different sizes. When the order arrived, he laid everything out on the bench and looked at it the way he used to look at a new site before beginning a job. He understood that most of this would go wrong at first. That was fine. He had been doing new things badly before doing them well for his entire life. The first book he attempted was not a real book. It was a collection of scrap paper he had bound together to practice the signatures, the stitching, the way the spine needed to be built before anything else would hold. It fell apart twice. On the 3rd attempt, it held. It was ugly and uneven, and he was quietly pleased with it. The first real job came from Patrice herself. A customer had left a large family Bible on her counter with a note saying the spine was gone and the cover was cracked, and could anyone help? Patrice had set it aside for weeks, not knowing what to do with it. And then one morning she carried it through the door to Clifford's room and set it on the bench and said she had no idea if this was his kind of thing. He looked at it carefully. He turned it over. He checked the condition of the pages, the state of the original binding, how much of the structure remained. Then he said he'd have it back to her in 2 weeks. It took him 11 days. He had to reback it entirely, which meant removing the old cover material, cleaning the spine, restitching the text block with waxed linen, building a new case, and then recovering it with a piece of dark leather he had sourced from a craft supplier in Cleveland. He worked in the mornings mostly, from 7 until noon, then returned after lunch. He made mistakes. He corrected them. By the time he was done, the Bible was not identical to what it had been, but it was solid and clean and would last another 50 years without complaint. The customer, a woman named Bertie Claus, whose grandmother had brought that Bible from Georgia in the 1940s, held it with both hands when Patrice gave it back to her. She stood at the counter and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. Then she asked who had done the work. Patrice pointed to the back room. Bertie walked to the doorway and looked in. Clifford was at the bench, working on something else. He looked up. She said she didn't know how to thank him. He said there was nothing to thank him for. It had been a good book to work on. It was in those weeks, in that quiet room, with the north light coming in and the smell of paste and leather and old paper around him, that Clifford found the particular piece that had been missing since Adeyemi died. Not happiness, exactly. Something more reliable than happiness. A kind of dailiness that was entirely his own, that no meeting or agenda or printed summary could reach. He found the bone folder at the bottom of the box one morning and added it to his bench. He had bought other folders by then, newer ones in different shapes, but there was something in the weight of this one, in the particular smoothness of the old ivory, that he preferred. He began using it for everything. When he pressed a folded sheet or burnished a spine, this was the tool in his hand. It fit there as if it had always been waiting. This was the room. This was the work. This was the life he had not known he was going to build. If this story is speaking to you, please subscribe to Old Hand's New Life. There are many more stories here that deserve to be heard. Constance Mawale, the head librarian at Dennisville Public, had heard about the Bible from Bertie Claus at a church social. She stopped into Patrice's shop the following week on an errand, learned Clifford was in the back, and knocked on the door frame. She introduced herself and got to the point immediately. She said the library had 37 volumes of local archive material dating from the 1880s forward that had been deteriorating for years. She said the restoration quotes she had received from professional conservators were beyond the library's budget by a factor of 5. She said she understood if this wasn't the kind of work he did. Clifford asked to see the books. She brought a box of 6 the next day. He went through them methodically, checking each spine, each page block, each cover. Some of them had water damage. One had been repaired at some point with household tape that had since yellowed and brittled and done additional harm. The oldest ones were in the most fragile condition, but also, he noted, in some ways the most workable. He said he could do them. He said he would charge her the cost of materials and nothing else. Constance looked at him for a moment. Then she said she would need to bring a small proposal to the library board for documentation purposes, and she would like to include his name. He said that was fine. She said she would also note that he was donating his labor. He said that was also fine. He didn't need it noted. She said that wasn't really up to him. He smiled at that. She left the box. Winter came in the way that Ohio winters do, gray and matter-of-fact, and Clifford worked through it. He worked on the library archive through November and December and into the new year. He documented each volume before and after. He developed a system for the water-damaged pages that he had worked out partly from the library books and partly from his own trial and correction. Some of it he invented. That was the part he was least sure about and most interested in. By February, he had completed 14 of the 37 volumes. Constance came in once a week to collect the finished ones and drop off new ones. She had begun bringing him coffee, which he had not asked for, and which he drank without comment. She had also begun bringing the occasional problem she could not solve, small questions about archive materials or storage conditions, and he found he usually had something useful to say about them. Word had continued to move in the way that words move in a town of 4,000 people. Not loudly. Through conversation, through connection, through the slow social mechanisms of a place where most people know most other people's business eventually. A retired schoolteacher in Hayfield, 12 miles east, mailed him a box containing 2 damaged journals and a collection of letters from the 1890s. A private collector in Millbridge asked Patrice if Clifford would look at a water-damaged county map. He said he would. Patrice had taken to stopping in his doorway most mornings on her way to open the shop. She didn't always say much. Sometimes she brought him something from the bakery on Millard Street, a roll or a small pastry, and set it on the corner of his bench without ceremony. She had a quality he appreciated, a directness, an absence of the particular kind of well-meaning concern that people had been directing at him since Adai's died, the concern that was really a form of reassurance for the person feeling it. Patrice didn't need reassuring. She just watched him work and occasionally said something worth hearing. She said one morning in March that he looked different than he had when she first gave him the key. He asked different how. She thought about it. She said he looked like he knew what he was doing again. He turned back to the bench. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said he supposed he did. Brett had heard things by February. Clifford knew this because Rennell called him on a Sunday evening and mentioned, carefully, that Brett had said something about Clifford renting a room somewhere. She said Brett was glad he was keeping busy. Clifford said that was kind of Brett. There was a pause. Rennell asked if he needed anything. He said he had everything he needed. She said she'd try to come up in the spring with the baby. He said he'd like that. He did not tell her about the work. He did not tell Brett. He answered the questions he was asked and volunteered nothing beyond them. It was on a gray afternoon in late March that Brett drove down Carver Street on his way from a client meeting. He had not intended to pass the shop. He had taken a different route because of a road closure and found himself on Carver Street without quite planning it. He slowed when he saw the light in the window of the back room. He could see Clifford clearly through the glass. His father was bent over the workbench with his full attention on something Brett couldn't identify from the car. Some small task that required both hands and the particular kind of concentration that looks from outside like a man at complete peace with what he is doing. Patrice was in the doorway to the back room, leaning against the frame, saying something that made Clifford look up and smile. Brett sat in his car on the far side of the street and watched for a minute, maybe slightly longer. He had a thought sitting there that he had not expected to have. He thought, maybe I should call him. Not about logistics, not about the room fees or the assisted living costs or the question of whether the arrangement was sustainable. Just to call and talk the way they used to talk before the meeting, before the agenda, before everything had become something to be managed. He sat with that thought for a moment. Then he looked at the time on his dashboard, put the car in drive, and pulled away from the curb. He told himself he would call later that week. He did not call. By April, Constance had submitted a brief description of the archive restoration project to the Ohio Preservation Network's newsletter, a quarterly publication that circulated among librarians, archivists, and private collectors across the state. She had included Clifford's name and a brief description of his methods. She had not told him she was doing this. She mentioned it afterward in passing, and he said he didn't mind. The newsletter piece was read by a staff writer at the network's quarterly journal, who was looking for a feature on community-based preservation work. She contacted Constance. Constance gave her Clifford's phone number. He spoke with her on the phone for 40 minutes on a Tuesday morning from the bench in his room, his bone folder in his hand, the way it always was when he was thinking. He answered her questions plainly. He did not describe himself as anything in particular. When she asked him what had led him to take up the work, he said he'd had some free time and a good room to work in. She laughed. He said that was the honest answer. The Ohio Preservation Network's quarterly journal was published in the second week of May. The feature ran to 4 pages. There was a photograph of the restored archive volumes arranged on the library table, their spines repaired and clean, the oldest ones given new covers that matched the period materials as closely as Clifford had been able to source. Clifford was not in the photograph, which was how he had wanted it, but his name was in the headline. The article described him as a self-taught bookbinder working out of a rented workroom in Dennisville, Ohio, who had restored 31 of the library's 37 deteriorating archive volumes over the course of a single winter, at no labor cost to the library, using methods he had largely developed himself through practical experimentation. It described the work as significant. It used the phrase "remarkable recovery" twice. Len Harwick had been editor of the Dennisville Courier-Gazette for 17 years. He had a subscription to the network journal because his wife was a retired librarian, and it came to the house, and he read it when there was nothing else on the kitchen table. He read the Clifford article on a Thursday evening. He read it again. Then he called Constance at home. She said yes, she knew Clifford. She said yes, he was local. She said yes, she could give Len his number if Clifford agreed. Clifford agreed. Len ran the story the following Tuesday. The headline read, "Dennisville Man Recovers, City's Oldest Records." Beneath the headline, in smaller type, his full name and age. It ran on the front page, below the fold. In a town of 4,000 people, the front page below the fold was not nothing. The story was shared on the town's community Facebook page within an hour of the digital edition going live. By noon, it had been shared 38 times, which for Dennisville was considerable. Several people tagged Brett's name in the comments, not with any apparent intent, simply because he was known and Clifford was his father, and people in small towns make those connections automatically. Brett saw the tags on his phone while he was eating lunch. He read the article. He read it a second time. He sat with his phone in his hand for a while, in the break room of his office building, alone. On Thursday morning, Constance came to the back room before Clifford had even gotten his coat off. She was carrying a folded copy of the Courier-Gazette, and her expression was one he had not seen on her before, something between delight and a kind of barely contained satisfaction that she was clearly trying to present as professional composure. She set the paper on the workbench beside his tools without saying anything. He picked it up. He read it. He read it to the end. Then he set it down beside the bone folder, which was lying where he always left it, on the right side of the bench, slightly angled, the pale ivory of it catching the morning light the way it always did at that hour. He looked at it for a moment. He picked up the bone folder and turned back to the volume he had been working on when she knocked. Constance stayed in the doorway. She was watching him. After a moment, she said, "Is that all you're going to do?" He smoothed a page with the folder. He said, "What else would I do?" She laughed. It was a short, full laugh. The kind that comes out before you can decide whether it's appropriate. She put her hand over her mouth. Then she lowered it and looked at him with an expression that Len Harwick, who had come in behind her quietly and was standing just outside the doorframe with a notepad he hadn't opened, described later as the expression of someone watching a person refuse, simply and completely, to be diminished. Len did not write about that part. He wrote it in his own notebook that evening and kept it there. Clifford did not look up from the page. The bone folder moved across the paper in the same long, smooth motion it had made every morning for months now. The morning light was coming through the high north window the way it always did at that hour. The room smelled of paste and leather and old paper and something else, something harder to name, the particular atmosphere of a place where a person has been doing exactly the right thing for exactly the right reasons, and the room has absorbed it. He had 31 volumes done and 6 still to go. He kept working. Summer came. Clifford finished the archive, all 37 volumes, clean and solid and ready for another 100 years. Constance had them displayed in a case in the library's main reading room with a small printed card that gave the dates of the restoration and his name. He had moved on to other things by then. The collector in Millbridge had sent 2 more pieces. A high school history teacher in Dennisville had found him through the newspaper article and brought him a deteriorating set of county land records that a local family had been keeping in a garret. He was booked 3 months ahead. He walked to Carver Street every morning. He worked until noon. He walked back to Meadowgate for lunch, read for an hour, returned at 2, left at 5. Patrice still stopped in the doorway most mornings. She had stopped bringing pastries from the bakery and started making them herself, which was better. Renelle came up in June with the baby, a girl named Cora, who was 4 months old and very interested in ceiling fixtures. Clifford held her for the better part of an afternoon. He showed Renelle the workroom. She stood in it for a long moment, looking at the bench, the tools, the finished volumes stacked on the shelf he had added along the east wall. She said she hadn't known about any of this. He said she knew, now. Brett did not come. Clifford did not expect him to. There was no anger in this, no particular weight. Brett was who he was. The work was what it was. These 2 facts existed separately now and did not require any third thing from him. On an evening in late July, with the light going long and golden out of the west and the shop quiet around him, Clifford sat at the bench and did something he had not done in years. He made something purely for the pleasure of it. Not for a client, not for the library, not for anyone at all. He took a small piece of pale blue paper and a scrap of dark cloth and a length of waxed linen thread, and he made a tiny book, no bigger than the palm of his hand, with nothing written in it, just empty pages, clean and well-made and his. He held it when it was done. He turned it over. He set it on the bench beside the bone folder. Outside, the last of the light was leaving the street. He turned off the lamp and sat in the almost dark for a moment, the small empty book in his hands, and he felt, with a completeness he had not expected and did not try to name, that the man who had sat at that kitchen table and listened to his son explain his own life back to him was not quite the same man who was sitting here now. The difference was not loud, it was not announced, it simply was. If you have ever been told that a decision about your own life has already been made for you, this story belongs to you. There is a particular kind of strength in a person who does not argue, does not explain, and does not wait for an apology. They simply build, they simply continue, and time does the rest. What did you take from Clifford's story? Have you ever made a quiet choice, one that no one around you understood at the time, that turned out to be the most important thing you ever did? Share your answer in the comments. This channel exists because of the people who do exactly that. If you have not yet subscribed to Old Hand's New Life, please do so now. Every story on this channel is built around the quiet dignity of people who refuse to be written off. There are more stories waiting for you here.